So Dan Assisi speaks on spirituality and Spiritism in the US and also internationally. He's known for a mix of irreverence and deep thinking, and he shares a message of hope and love through rational faith that both inspires and educates audiences about our spiritual nature. He is a founding member of the Spiritist Institute and a board member of the California Spiritist Association. You can find him as the host of the Spiritist Conversations podcast. He holds a doctorate degree in education and a master's in public administration with a graduate certificate in public policy from the University of Southern California. And well, that's it for the introductions. It's a huge pleasure to have you with us. Dan, thank you so much again for accepting our invitation, and you have the floor.
Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. First, because it's always great to make new friends and meet old ones, but also because I think this format of questions and answers, of interaction, is just a really great one. I really do think that that's how we learn best. It's when we have these informal conversations with each other and have a chance to exchange ideas and interact with each other and just really learn together. So it's always very exciting to me to be able to get closer to folks this way, rather than a formal kind of presentation, which is not a bad thing in itself, but I myself enjoy this kind of approach, where we have a chance to talk to each other and really comment and ask questions and interact and pose questions, like I said. So thank you for having me. I know that we have a time, right? So we want to be mindful of time. So my plan is not to babble too much. Is to try to set things up a little bit and then maybe have some time for us to interact and think together about the topic. Does that make sense? Is that okay? Is that a good plan for everybody? And as usual, the drill. Make yourself comfortable, pull your own happiness wagon. If you have to turn your camera off, do it. If you have to go to the restroom, do it. Whatever works for you. But it's always great to see you there, and you can stop me at any time. That's not going to bother me. Thanks for the thumbs up there. I appreciate it. I see you. Even if you are on the train. I appreciate you being on the train, as a matter of fact, as I appreciate all of you guys taking some time of what I presume it's a beautiful afternoon out there, because I am seeing your background, your window back there, you people, and I see that's a beautiful weather out there as it is here in San Diego. So thank you for taking the time and for inviting me. I really appreciate it. All right, so shall we jump into things? All right, so when Cristiani invited me to be a part of today's conversation, I was really thinking about what would make sense for us to chat. And she had said that you guys were studying the Gospel according to Spiritism, and that this was chapter 11. And you know the drill. Chapter 11 is oftentimes known as a beautiful chapter because it really is about love your neighbor as oneself. And so I'm not going to do any kind of formal presentation. Now we have some stuff on the screen just to kind of guide us. I think you can see it probably, right, on my camera. But this is a beautiful chapter, and it's a fascinating one. And I figured in my mind that it really is about how we treat others and how we treat ourselves as well. So from that perspective, it really is about that thing that we have come to know as the golden rule. And so I try to label our topic today as Golden Rule 2.0, because I do think that it's time to upgrade our understanding of what the Golden Rule is and how it works. And so what we hope to do today is just spend some time talking about that, framing it in a way that hopefully will make it easier for us to chat about the topic of personal transformation. And then, of course, engage and see if that makes sense to us or if we think that there might be other things that we missed. So I think a good place to start is with the obvious question here of, oh my goodness, love your neighbor as oneself. That's a hard place to start because from the beginning, we have a really tough tough word there. And that word really is what? That word is love. Really? Love, right? Do we have to really love each other? Is it really love that we're supposed to be doing towards everybody? And it's a big word because we don't quite understand love just yet. So let's hold that aside for a second, because I think that the understanding of love changes with time. And let's just first dive in how did this love your neighbor as oneself came about? What were the historical predecessors to the idea of what Jesus brings to us? And then see how we can move from there. So when we talk about the golden rule, which is this thing that all cultures have, right? From our ancient Greece to ancient Rome, we find that in Sanskrit, in the language of the old Vedas, we find it in Islam, we find it everywhere else, this idea of treating people nicely, or at least as we would like to be treated. For us, in the Christian religion, the Judaico-Christian tradition, we are going to see one of the first instances of this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself in a book of the Old Testament, in Leviticus, chapter 19 and 18 and 19:18. Let's try to, sorry, new mouth. First day with my new mouth. I'm still getting used to it. Chapter 19, verse 18. And then, of course, later on, we find that in the New Testament, which generally we pay more attention to because it's about the Christ in the New Testament, and we really like the Christ. So it really becomes more apparent in Matthew and in Luke, so different Gospels in the New Testament, that we start talking about all this. And this idea of treating your neighbor as yourself, or treating others as you would like to be treated, it's a fascinating topic. Because it really starts to, as in a fundamental, starts to shift our focus. It shifts our focus from ourselves on just what we want to start to consider what other people might want, right? So it's a very fascinating piece because it starts to lead us outside of ourselves. But there's also something very interesting there, and I like to call it the golden math for the golden rule, because it makes sense for us to talk about other people and their interests when we are deciding what to do. Because if we are just to care for our own interests and really be selfish, then there's only one person watching out for us, and that would be us. However, when we start to consider other people and what they might want or might be best for them, then an interesting scenario starts to take place. We start to caring for other people and they start caring for us. And so in a roundabout way, what I am trying to say is we start to have 7 billion people, or whatever the population of the earth is, starting to watch out for our own interest and well-being. So mathematically speaking, if you really want to be selfish, you really, in a smart way, you really want to care about others, because it would benefit you to care about others, because they will care then back in turn for you. However, that's not our motivation. We know that. But it's an interesting perspective for us to say that even if we are to be selfish, let's be selfish in a kind and smart way, which means let's make sure we take care of others as well. And of course, you know, when we start thinking about being kind to others, it's not just about this lifetime. We understand as well that in Spiritism, we have our horizons open, so to speak, and actually blown to smithereens, because we stop thinking just in this lifetime or about this lifetime. We start to realize that we are immortal spirits. And that means that we have lived lives before this one, and that we will live many more lives after this one. So what does that mean? It really means that there is an added incentive for us to think about how do we treat others. Because the way we treat others is not only going to impact our current lifetime, but it might impact many other lifetimes as well. So we have an added benefit of really thinking about how do we behave and how do we treat others, because we know as a fact now, because we have mediumship and we have had communication from the spirits telling us that we have many lives, and some of us can even remember past lives, we know that the actions that we carry out in this lifetime may affect our future lives. So treating others, the treatment of others and of ourselves as well, is something that is important for us to concern. It is something that it benefits us to think about. So if we want to be spiritually selfish, we ought to not only think about how we treat others today, but how that will impact the world ahead for us. So it's a really interesting piece, this whole golden math thing, because at the beginning, the golden rule seems very limiting, right? Like it's saying, like, I can no longer do things that I wanted to do. I just now have to think about other people. But when we really think about the benefits of limiting some of our actions because of how that will come across other people, or how it will affect other people, it does teach us how to move our lives in a roundabout way, because it does help us to think differently and grow. So it's a really interesting piece, because the more we understand that it's important for us to think of others, the more we have our life transformed and our perspective changed. And the more that we have our perspective changed, the more we see the things that we used to consider in the past may not necessarily be what we want to do in the future, right? So without babbling too much and kind of moving on, this question of love comes back again. So do we really have to love other people? And what it really is love? We always have this idea of love as a romantic thing, or even sometimes as a sensual thing. But I think that as we grow more mature, at least I would hope so, we start to understand that a lot of love has to do with companionship and caring for other people's interests without wanting anything in back, right? I think that we have that better illustrated when we become parents and we begin to understand that there is a whole little life form that is dependent on you. And oftentimes you wonder, if you're a parent, and how the heck can you love something that is so annoying and so difficult and so troublesome and that demands so much work and dedication and that literally kills your social life, but yet you love that thing so much. And by that thing, I mean that human or that child, right? And so sometimes our children drive us to the absolute limit of patience and exhaustion, and we feel like we just want to strangle them, yet they smile at us and we melt. And it's almost like they know how to push our limits just enough, right? When we're about to break mentally, they just give us that smile and we're back to the beginning. So if you haven't had children, keep those words of wisdom in their back pocket. If you have, I think you know what I'm talking about. But it is this love outside of ourselves. It's a different kind of love. And it's a really a game changer in the way we understand giving to others and for others. So it's important for us to say that, because I think that when Jesus is talking about loving your neighbors, obviously we're not talking about sensual love. We're not talking about lascivious love. We're talking about caring for people's interest without wanting any back. And so it behooves us sometimes to demystify that word a little bit, because we do have fairy tales about what love looks like that not always are helpful to us in our lives, even to our romantic relationships. Sometimes we have these high expectations of what love should be, and sometimes we find out that love is quite different than what we first envisioned, right? So because we don't talk about that very often. So I wanted to start talking about love there because it's important, and I think it's very germane to everything else that we're talking about. So one of the questions that we should ask ourselves is, what is love for me? And how do I know what love is, right? These are conversations for us to have offline. These are rhetorical questions. But I think it's good for us to talk about that even from a relationship perspective, because love changes with time too. If you are in a romantic relationship, you will know that after many years, love will transform itself and it will grow in different ways. And as a matter of fact, sometimes I get worried because I see a lot of people thinking that relationship is not working out because they do not feel towards their companion like they used to feel before. And that's okay, because love transforms into companionship, right? You might not feel that passion, that fire, 30 years into a marriage that you felt before, but at the same time, you have a higher degree of companionship and understanding that was not before either, right? So love changes and transforms with time. So loving your neighbor has that component of changing with time too. And so how can we understand that? How can we make it more actionable? Because this is something that I've struggled myself quite a bit with, because I read that sentence earlier on in my life and say, love your neighbor. And it was almost like an immediate stop. Like, I cannot possibly love other people on command, right? I can't possibly just turn on the love switch and do that. So what does that mean? And so to kind of help you understand how I'm thinking about, I thought about an interesting way of looking at this. And I call this the line, right? So imagine a line, a simple line that goes from left to right, whatever it is that you want to. And that in this line, there are 3 stops, right? And I like to think that this line has sort of like a clue for how we develop in our understanding of self and others, and how we relate to the world. And so in the first stop of this line, I call it the selfishness stop. In this phase, right, in the beginning of the line here on the left side, so to speak, imagine that in this space, we're selfish because we're still developing. And what does that mean? In this psychological positioning that we find ourselves in, we really do anything that we want for here and now, or just for ourselves, to the point where we really would do something that would hurt other people, and that does not matter to us because we're going to get what we want, right? So in that stage of psychological understanding of the world, it's a very inward centered. You don't really care about people on the outside that much. The only love, if you can call that, is really love for number one, right? Number one being ourselves. And that is the first stop on that line. Now, after that, I think there's a step sometimes that we forget. And the second stop on the line is the self-centeredness step. And this is where we still think we are the sun, like we're the center of the universe. But the difference between self-centeredness and selfishness, in my perspective, is when you are selfish, you know what you're doing and you're doing it anyways. And when you're self-centered, sometimes you're doing something, it might be harming other people, but you are unaware and unintentional about it, right? You are no longer selfish. You're not doing whatever it takes to get happy, and by means like you would actively step on other people's toes. When you're self-centered, you have left that intention behind you. You're no longer trying to hurt people. You're actually not trying to hurt people. It's just that you don't see them, right? You're just still, you made that progress of like being kinder and developing yourself, but you just are not aware there are other people out there. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because sometimes people will do things that hurt us in a specific way. And sometimes they would do that because they think that will make them happy. And sometimes they do it because they're unaware that we're there, right? It's almost like a child that closes their eyes and like thinks that they're hiding. If you ever played peekaboo with a child, right? Go hide, and they go like this. And because they cover their eyes, they think that the world has stopped. Since they cannot see anything, clearly you cannot see them, right? They're still a little bit unaware of what's happening outside. And I always ask that question because I feel like we sometimes judge other people's actions by thinking that they are selfish. But I think sometimes they're not selfish. They're just unaware that you're there. And so it helps us understand that they have moved from selfishness to self-centeredness. It's sort of like before and after Copernicus and the science, right? Before Copernicus, we thought that the whole universe revolved around the Earth. Then after we understood that through looking at the skies with science and everything else, we realized that actually it was the Earth that revolved around the sun. But before that, we think that everybody revolves around us, right? And when we get to that point of self-centeredness, I also want to say that this is a moment for us to celebrate, because it is better for us to be self-centered than selfish. So sometimes we beat ourselves up so much, but because we're not making the right things or because we accidentally hurt people, But I would love for us to hold it in our minds that there is a difference when we hurt people on purpose and when we hurt people by accident. That is already a sign of evolution when we are able to shift from selfishness to self-centeredness. So when that happens, we beat ourselves over the head, but we could also at least see in the positive side and say, hey, at least I didn't do that on purpose. It doesn't excuse us from having to make up for what we have done and be responsible for our actions, but it starts to show us that we are making progress along that line. Because sometimes I feel like we don't see the progress in ourselves. Sometimes I feel like when we start to study, Spiritism and any other kind of idea that leads you inwards to evaluate yourselves, we only see our darkest spots. We only see the things that we need to work on. We only start to think that maybe we're not that great, right? Because we haven't faced those things before, and now we do, and we're like, oh, I'm the worst person ever in the universe. You're not. Right? Clearly, there are people who are far behind in the evolutionary scale than you are. You're not the best person out there in the universe. You're not the worst, right? It's okay to be in the middle on this one. But this is very important because we start to become aware of ourselves. When we are able to move from selfishness to self-centeredness, and when we start to move towards the third stop, we become more aware of how we become aware of others. It's kind of like metaphysical, right? We start to think about how we perceive others. Before we didn't care, then was an accident, and then on the way to the third spot, we like, oh, did I notice people there? Are they there? Are they not there? We start to think about that, and it's a beautiful moment because this is when we start coming out of ourselves, right? From the second to the third stop, when we come out of ourselves to consider that we actually share the universe with other folks. That we're actually playing the same sandbox, but it's not ours. And that is a beautiful moment because that is when it allows us to start to have the prerequisites that it will take for us to maintain healthy and kind relationships. Because relationships, by definition, whether they're romantic relationships or friendship relationships, they are a give and take. When we are on the selfishness or self-centered piece, we are making more withdrawals from our relationship bank than we are making deposits. We want things out of people, and we're not even worried about giving something back. But when we are on, self-centeredness going towards the third spot, we begin to give of ourselves. And what is this third spot? Well, this third stop on the line is altruism. This ability for us to give to other people, to direct our actions towards other people, and not necessarily thinking of ourselves, but thinking of them. So when we're talking about loving our neighbor as ourselves, we are beginning to make this shift from self-centeredness to altruism, to really care about other people and how their role and their place and their life in the universe is. That is very hard. Right? Because there's a lot of people out there. And because that also requires us to change the way that we behave. And like we talked about before, that means we start to self-impose limits to ourselves and saying, I am going to not do this that I want because it won't benefit the other person. Right? And if you have been in a relationship, you know that this will happen in one or two ways. You do it because you feel you need to, but sometimes it happens because you want to. And that is a beautiful moment when you want to do something for somebody else, even at some expense to you. And I also want to stop here to celebrate because I think we do that so often in our days too that we don't realize. And sometimes the sacrifices we make are not that big, but they're sacrifices anyways, right? Sometimes you're sitting with your colleague or with your partner, and they are thirsty, and they say they're going to get a cup of water. You say, no, don't worry about it. I'll go. And so you stand up and you get it for them. Yes, seems like a small act, but it's a beautiful one nevertheless. You're saying, I am going to give up or sacrifice my watching TV for these 10, 15 seconds that it takes me to go over there and do it, but I'm going to do it for you, and I don't expect anything in return. So sometimes when we struggle to see the great things that we do, it's nice for us to think about the small things that we do and see that we are making progress towards getting to that eventual third stop of altruism and loving one another, right? And loving your neighbor. Does that make sense so far? So I like to put this in a spectrum because I want us to have something concrete that we can relate to. Because if we don't have some sort of framework in our minds that we can work through, it becomes either you love your neighbor or you don't. And that's not helpful. It's nice to have intermediary steps that you can work on. And when you don't know how to love your neighbor and you want to, like having a framework will help you. So how do I get to that love piece? Well, let me start caring for them. Let me first start caring about what they care about. Let me think about where I am in this line of selfishness, self-centeredness, and altruistic behavior, right? And these are questions that we answer to ourselves individually. Nobody needs to raise their hands and say, "Oh, I'm on the second to third stop," or because you might be in different stops in different aspects of your life or in different phases of your life. Sometimes we slide back in some situations. Sometimes we think we're really great, but something happens and we lose some patience and we're thrown back a little bit in some situations. Don't think that you're a fixed point in the universe, right? Because we all are evolving constantly, and so our reactions will evolve. The important thing is for us to continue to move and be self-aware. And that's a fascinating thing. And talking about self-awareness, and I don't want to talk too much more, but what I really wanted to point out here as well, that one thing that we have not talked about, which I think is the key part for the golden rule and love your neighbor as yourself, is the measuring stick. What do I mean by that? There is a Greek philosopher called Anaximenes who said, man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and things that are not, that they're not. And it's a very fancy and smart way of saying, we make our reality. We are the judges of things. If we believe in something, then it is. If we don't believe in something, then it is not, right? And this is a really metaphysical consideration, ooh, right? But it's a really interesting one because when we are talking about loving our neighbor, we forget that the reference point is us. So we are the ones that decide what loving our neighbor is because we are the ones that have the conception of what love is. So it's important for us, if we truly want to move down that line to altruism, to go back to what we're talking about and think about what is love for us. Because if we change our perception of love and how it ought to be, it will necessarily change the way we behave towards others. So if you want to improve your altruistic behavior, think more about what love is. Because with that new definition of love, you will be able to act differently. That's why we find in the Spirit's book this wonderful hint that, that our our moral development follows intellectual development. First, you need to understand the world to then be able to act on it. So that's why we study so much in Spiritism, to see things differently. And when we see things differently, we can act on them. We can act differently. If we did not understand that our actions are hurting other people, we would never change that behavior. And we will repeat ourselves in these cycles and reincarnations and everything else that we have. But when we do, when we understand as reincarnation that our actions are hurting other people, then we can change our behavior. When we understand how we can be helpful to them in different ways, then we can change our behavior. But it's still predicated on what we think right or wrong is. So the golden rule is really about what we think we should be doing, right? But here's where the 2.0 golden rule comes in, the whole thing about reinventing itself. If you are a fan of the JC, like I am, and by the JC, I mean our older brother, the Jesus Christ. I call him the Jesus Christ sometimes because that makes me look really hip and cool, because I'm not, but I want to be. But when you think about your older brother, when you think about Jesus, we sometimes just attain ourselves to those passages in Matthew and Luke, like love yourself as your neighbor, and we forget one fundamental passage. At the end of his passage here with us, in the Gospel of John, when they are all eating at the Last Supper, after Judas has left, Jesus has this wonderful chat with the disciples in which he says, in a little bit, you're going to see me. A little bit, you don't see me again. You might know that part. You've seen that other parts of the promised consoler. But he says, a new commandment I give you, a new commandment I leave you, that you love one another as I have loved you. Whoa. Whoa. Because he's saying, it's time for an upgrade to our golden rule. Now that I have this time with me, which is symbolically speaking of now that you have spent time with these teachings that come from God, you should understand that the measuring stick changes. It's not about what you think should be done to other people, because our conception of what we want and what other people would want is still fleeting and inadequate. So what the new measuring stick becomes is the behavior of Jesus, that love one another as Jesus has loved you. And so how do we up our game to treat other people as Jesus would have treated us? That's a fundamentally different decision. Because Daniel, might think that treating you nicely is giving you a box of bonbons, right? Because I like bonbons. But that might not be the best thing for you, because I was thinking of what's best for you from my limited perception. I was making the assumption that what I like, you like. But the last step to altruism is not about giving you what I like. It's about helping you with what's best for you, as understood by a higher spiritual being. And that is such a great transition. It's an incredible transformation that blows my mind, because it's hard to really think about what God or Jesus would want for other people, because it really helps you, really makes you come out of yourselves to consider what other people are going through and what they are passing through in their lives and what would be best for them because of that and not because of what we want. It is the good old, what would Jesus do? So when we're talking about loving our neighbor, and we really think about this upgrade to this golden rule that has been with us for thousands of years, what we're really talking about is, how do we think more like the Christ? How do we start to work in the world more like the Christ? That is a fundamental challenge that will necessarily transform our lives. Do we have a clear answer for that? No. At our level, it's hard for us to even think about that, right? To even conceive of who Jesus was and what he has done for us. But nevertheless, it asks us to try. It asks us to come out of ourselves, our existence in this space and time, in this moment, and consider what will be best for other people, not by what I want and not by what, materially speaking, the world thinks, but what will be best for that person from a spiritual perspective. That is a fascinating shift in our mindset. And I find that Spiritism is uniquely equipped to help us through that process, because Spiritism reminds us that we are not the physical body that we are looking at. That we are temporarily vested in a physical body, but that's not who we are. So the understanding of who we are, once again, will help us decide and dictate how we behave towards others. If we are able to see ourselves as spiritual beings, then we necessarily must extend that grace to other people too. We must also think of them as spiritual beings. Right? If I am a spiritual being in constant progress, then Christiane is also one. Isabel is also one. And so what Christiane does and Isabel does are not fixed points in time. They're changing. They are also growing. So I have to be more tolerant. What Paloma does, what Vandalci does, all of that has to be taken into considerations. We have to be more patient because we understand from a biggest vantage point who our neighbor are. And that's a fascinating thing for me, because oftentimes I struggle with remembering my immortal essence. Life comes with us in so many different ways. So we forget that we're spirits. We don't even stop to think about during our daily lives. So how do we remember how do we remind ourselves that we ought to remember who we truly are? Because without understanding our spiritual essence, it will be hard for us to understand ourselves, and it will be even harder for us to understand what Jesus would do. Because Jesus no longer thought of things like we do with a material perspective. Everything that he did and came to do was guided by his spiritual awareness. The fact that he lived a whole life and then sacrificed his physical body so that we could learn is a proof of that, without fretting, because he wasn't thinking in this level anymore. He was thinking over here. So how do we up our game in loving our neighbor? It's the question of the moment. And I feel like it is a wonderful question for our times. This COVID times and this new planetary transition time is, how do we make that shift of just wanting the world to do what we think is best to what is actually best spiritually for everybody? I think that this is the defining question of our times, of the moment right now. How do we put aside our wants and our needs to make sure that everybody is okay? How do we treat our neighbor, whether our neighbor is in that little square to my side, right? Or it's 6,000 miles away, or is somebody I have never seen? That, I think, is a fascinating piece. And I hope that this kind of thinking and that framework of thinking of where you are on the line, right, that we made up, the line of selfishness to self-centeredness to altruism, like, where are you and what are the steps that you could do to move yourself along the way in a sustainable way, knowing that things are not going to change overnight, but that every day we can practice being kinder to each other because we now know what are the benefits of doing so, that it benefits us, that there is a golden math to it, like helping. Maybe that's why our cousin Francis of Assisi said that it is in giving that we receive, because it is in helping others that we are helped too. It is taking care of others, others take care of us. That golden math works on that sense. So lots of different contemplations there for us to see, and how to deal with treating others better and treating ourselves better too, and investing in thinking and changing our perception so that we can then act differently into the world. So there are some thoughts on chapter 11, right? Loving your neighbor in a slightly different approach, a slightly different way than you otherwise might see in the chapter. But all these things were provoked by that chapter. They are awakened in me by reading that chapter, by thinking about how do we relate with others and the words of Jesus. Does that make sense? So I stopped there and I tossed the ball back to you, see if there's anything that didn't make sense to you, that I wasn't clear, or that you'd like to comment on.